My name is Vivian Cole, and I'm 36 years old. 2 Thanksgivings ago, my mother handed me an envelope across her dining room table, pressed her palm flat on top of it like she was sealing a deal, and told me it was time I stopped drifting. Inside that envelope was an offer letter to become my brother's executive assistant for $58,000 a year. My parents had been planning that dinner for a month. My brother sat there nodding along like a man watching his own campaign ad. Not one person at that table knew I controlled a real estate development firm worth just over $2 billion. They thought I restored old houses for a hobby and lived off whatever scraps came from flipping a duplex here and there. I let them believe it, because I wanted to know exactly how my family treats someone they think has nothing. By the time dessert was cleared, my brother was standing in the driveway with his hands shaking, and it had nothing to do with anything I own. But here's what nobody in that house knew when I walked through the door that night. The envelope with my name on it was the smallest thing waiting for me at that table. Welcome back to Quiet Confessions, where women tell you the stories nobody saw coming. Stories about the moment a family finally finds out who they've been underestimating. If you've ever sat at your own family's table and felt smaller than you are, this one's for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and subscribe if you haven't yet, because you don't want to miss where this one goes. Let me take you back to an ordinary Tuesday, 4 days before that dinner. At 9 in the morning, I was on a ladder in the front room of a shotgun house on Bull Street in Savannah, Georgia, scraping 70 years of paint off original heart pine trim, while my contractor, Desmond, argued with a supplier on speakerphone about a delivery of reclaimed brick. That house is one of 6 I own on that block, all mid-renovation, all part of a restoration project the Historic District Board has mentioned twice in their newsletter. To my neighbors, I'm just Vivian, the woman who bought the ugly houses and made them beautiful again, drives a 15-year-old pickup truck with primer spots on the door, and always has sawdust somewhere on her jeans. I drive that truck because I like the way it handles gravel roads. Try explaining that to my mother. Here's what the Historic District doesn't see. At 4 that afternoon, I climbed into the truck, drove to a rented office above a coffee shop 2 blocks over, opened my laptop, and wired the closing funds on a $110 million mixed-use acquisition in Charlotte. 1 phone call to my attorney, 1 digital signature. Then I drove back to Bull Street and helped Desmond figure out where the delivery truck had gotten lost. That's my life. I founded Cole Meridian Group 11 years ago. We buy distressed properties, historic buildings mostly, and turn them into mixed-use developments across the Southeast. Apartments over retail, adaptive reuse of old mills and warehouses, the unglamorous backbone work that reshapes a downtown without anyone noticing who's behind it. Our last valuation, after the Charlotte deal closed, put the company just above $2 billion. I own 71% outright. Outside my attorney, my CFO, and a small circle of bankers bound by confidentiality agreements, exactly 2 people alive knew that name was attached to any of it. My chief operating officer, Renata Ford, who does every public-facing appearance, every interview, every ribbon cutting, and my grandfather, Walton, who knew I did well and never once asked me to put a number on it. My parents believed I was 1 slow renovation season away from asking them for a loan. I had never once corrected them. You'll understand why in a minute, because that Tuesday, while I still had paint flakes in my hair, my mother called. My mother's phone voice comes in exactly 2 settings, syrup and steel, and she can move between them in the space of a comma. Vivian, honey, Thanksgiving, our house, 4 o'clock, we're celebrating your brother. I asked what we were celebrating. The pause she left was theater, pure and rehearsed. Marcus made senior vice president at Ashford Capital, base plus bonus close to $550,000. Vivian, a vice president in this family. She let the number hang there the way people let good wine breathe. Then the steel came out, smooth as a blade sliding from a drawer. And there's something we want to talk to you about too, sweetheart, about your future. You're 36. The house flipping thing was cute for a while, but cute doesn't build a retirement, does it? I looked out the window at the crew loading tools into the truck bed and told her I'd be there. Wear something decent, she said. Marcus is bringing his fiancé's father. Big name in banking. Please don't talk about houses all night. Then her voice softened into the sentence I have heard my whole adult life, the one she genuinely believes is love. We just want you to matter to somebody, Vivian. She hung up before I could answer, which didn't matter, because in 13 years I had never found an answer she could actually hear. I stood on that ladder a while longer, paint scraper still in my hand, a woman who had closed a $110 million deal 4 hours earlier, being told to wear something decent so I wouldn't embarrass the family in front of an important man. Here's the thing you should know about me at this point in the story. I wasn't angry yet. Anger needs hope standing behind it, and mine had scar tissue where that hope used to live. To show you where that scar came from, I need to take you back 13 years. I was 23, and I had just watched my first business collapse. It was a small architectural salvage company, one leased warehouse, a website I built myself at my kitchen table, 16 months of 18-hour days pulling fixtures and mantles out of condemned buildings before the wrecking crews got there. A regional chain undercut every bid I made. I lost the warehouse lease, my savings, and most of my patience for the word entrepreneur. I came home that Thanksgiving hollowed out, looking for a plate of food and maybe one person who'd say, "You tried something hard." Instead, I got a family meeting. My mother had rearranged the living room like a courtroom, me on the piano bench, everyone else on the good furniture, aunts and uncles included, because shame in my family has always been a spectator sport. She had notes, actual index cards. She went through my failure line by line. The lease, the loan, the boyfriend who'd left in March, the 10 pounds I'd put on. My father studied the carpet the whole time. My brother Marcus, 25 then, and already climbing the ranks at a regional bank, said nothing at all. I remember the gravy congealing on the sideboard while my mother built toward her finish. She leaned forward, took both my hands like she was doing me some kindness, and said, "Dreams are a luxury for people who can afford the fall, sweetheart." My aunt actually murmured, "That's the truth." I spent that evening in the kitchen washing dishes so nobody would see my face, and somewhere between the roasting pan and the gravy boat, something in me went quiet and cold and stayed that way. They would never watch me try again. They would never really see me at all. If my ambitions were a luxury item, fine. I'd build them somewhere my family couldn't window shop. Here's what nobody warns you about secrecy. It starts as a bandage and calcifies into armor. And one day you look up and you've built a fortress and moved into it permanently. I took a job managing inventory at a building materials salvage yard outside Charleston. Learned the property business the way you learn a language, by drowning in it. At 24, I put together a spreadsheet model for identifying undervalued historic properties near transit corridors before the city rezoned them. Instead of selling the model, I used it myself, quit the salvage yard job, and started Coal Meridian with one investor and a laptop. Growth was slow, and then it wasn't. The way ice doesn't crack until suddenly it does, everywhere at once. We acquired our first mill building in year 3, a second and third in year 5. By year 8, downtown revitalization money was flowing into every southeastern city with a historic core, and trade publications started writing curious little pieces about the mysterious ownership behind Coal Meridian, because I'd structured everything through a chain of holding entities registered in Delaware. One reporter, in a piece I still have bookmarked, called the majority owner the architect nobody's ever met. I liked that. The architect nobody's ever met doesn't sit on a piano bench being read index cards. My rule was simple, and I want you to hear it, because it's close to the only confession I have. Information is currency, and I never let anyone spend mine without my permission. Not my parents, not old friends, not the men I dated, who all eventually left the way you leave a house where half the rooms stay locked. The first thing I ever bought with real money was the block on Bull Street. I put my own construction company's office above the coffee shop because nobody in my family would ever be curious about a woman who restores old houses for a living. In 11 years, exactly one outsider ever saw my face in a Coal Meridian boardroom. Remember that. It matters later. 2 days before Thanksgiving, at 9:40 at night, my phone lit up with a group text my mother had built called Thanksgiving Plan. I can only assume she assembled it in a hurry because there was one member she forgot to remove: me. The messages arrived in a cheerful little burst. First the menu, then the seating chart, which put me between my mother and Marcus's fiancée, Dana, which should have been my first warning, because you seat a flight risk between two handlers. Then this from my mother, punctuated with her favorite heart emoji. Dad will say a few words after the pie. Marcus presents the offer after that. Don't mention the assistant job until dessert is cleared. Let her enjoy the meal first. And 30 seconds later, the message I've reread more times than I'll ever admit to. Nobody tells Vivian ahead of time. She'll find a reason not to come. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the 3 little dots appear and vanish. Marcus had seen it. Dana had seen it. My father was presumably in the room while it was typed. Not one person wrote, "Wait, she's still in this thread." Not one person wrote, "Maybe we shouldn't ambush her on a holiday." The dots just stopped, and the silence afterward told me everything. This dinner was scripted, rehearsed, and cast with me as the problem to be solved after dessert, so the ambush would land on a full stomach. I set the phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. And here's the part I'm not proud of. Underneath the hurt, something cold and patient as a balance sheet sat up and took notice. That night brought no tears, because by then I had 13 years of practice avoiding them. What I did instead was make a decision I would spend the next 2 days telling myself was simple curiosity. They believed I was broke, unambitious, and running out of chances. Fine. I would walk into that dinner exactly as the woman they'd invented. Faded jeans, the truck, no defenses, and I would finally watch, clearly and without illusion, how my family treats a person they believe has nothing to offer. Every condescending comment would be a data point. Every seating chart and rehearsed toast would go in the file. When the night was over, I'd tally it like a closing statement and decide, once and for all, what these people had actually earned from me. You could call that a test. My grandfather would later call it something sharper, and he'd be right. But I'm telling this in order. I made my preparations because that's who I am. I told Renata to keep her phone on, but not to interrupt unless something truly couldn't wait. I decided to drive myself and park facing the street with my coat by the door. An exit plan. The kind you make for a building you expect to catch fire. Then, on the morning of the 23rd, My grandfather Walton called the office line above the coffee shop, which he never does. He's 88, still drives his old Ford truck to the hardware store every Saturday, and does not make phone calls for small talk. "You're coming Thursday?" he asked. I told him yes. There was a pause with real weight in it. "Good," he said. "I need you there, Vivi." He hung up before I could ask why. My grandfather has never once needed me at a family dinner. That afternoon, Renata sent me a file marked urgent after all, and I want you to appreciate the timing because I've had a year to sit with it and I'm still not finished appreciating it. It was a portfolio review. Ashford Capital, a regional investment bank, managed the debt financing for 4 of Cole Meridian's largest projects, including the Charlotte acquisition that had just closed. We were their single largest client relationship in the Southeast, and they were struggling. 2 covenant breaches in the last 2 quarters, a loan committee memo flagging concentration risk. Our analysts recommended pulling our financing relationship and moving to a competing lender by February, which for a bank Ashford's size, mid-tier, regional, proud, would be a serious blow to their credibility with every other client watching. I read the summary twice, flagged my concerns, and was drafting my approval when I reached the paragraph about Ashford's recent promotions, the new senior leadership they'd elevated to shore up client confidence heading into the new year. Marcus Cole, Senior Vice President, Debt Originations. I sat back and stared at that sentence for a long time. My brother's $500,000 triumph, the crown jewel of tomorrow's dinner, sat inside a bank my own analysts had just flagged in writing as carrying serious concentration risk, with us as the single largest exposure driving that risk. He had no idea I existed anywhere near his world. He had no idea his firm's biggest client relationship was being decided at a coffee shop office in Savannah. I typed one instruction to Renata. Hold the termination recommendation until after the holidays. No explanation. She didn't ask for one. That's why it's Renata. I told myself it was diligence, not mercy. Then I closed the laptop, wrapped my grandfather's Christmas present early since I wouldn't see him again until Thanksgiving, and laid out the oldest jeans and flannel I owned. The next afternoon, I parked the truck at the end of a line of cars worth more than my parents' house and walked in to be humiliated on schedule. My parents' house on Thanksgiving looked like a magazine spread had gone off. Garland on the stair rail, the good china out, a caterer's assistant taking coats at the door, which told me my mother had built an audience before she'd sent a single invitation. She met me in the foyer, kissed the air by my cheek, and did the full once-over. Boots, jeans, bare nails. "Oh, Vivian," she sighed, the voice other people reserve for a flat tire. "You could have made an effort. Well, come in before Dana's father sees you like that." The dining table was set for 12, and at each place sat a small cream card in calligraphy, and under most of the names a title. Marcus Cole, Senior Vice President, Ashford Capital. Dana Whitmore, soon to be Cole. My cousin's card read Pediatric Resident. My father's card said Head of Household, which would have been funny if any part of it were true. Mine said Vivian, just Vivian, floating there on all that cream cardstock like the calligrapher had run out of things to say. I was still looking at it when I felt someone watching me. By the fireplace stood a man I'd never met at any family gathering, silver at the temples, the kind of tan that comes from a boat rather than a beach, and the settled posture of someone who chairs things. My mother appeared at my elbow, glowing. "That's Whitman Reese, Dana's father. He's a managing director at Ashford, practically runs the Southeast region. Isn't it wonderful he could join us?" It was wonderful. It was also, though my mother had no way of knowing it, the single most dangerous thing she'd ever arranged in my presence. Because Whitman Reese was looking at me the way you look at a word sitting right on the tip of your tongue. And I had seen him before, across a closing table in Atlanta, 18 months earlier. I had come dressed as the naive, broke sister, and my family made the costume effortless because nobody double-checks a disguise they design themselves. During cocktail hour, I asked Marcus what a covenant breach meant and watched him grow 2 inches taller, explaining it slowly, like I was a child. I let my mother explain the word portfolio to me with hand gestures while her book club friends exchanged soft, pitying looks. My aunt asked if I was still doing the little house thing, and when I said yes, she squeezed my forearm the way you'd comfort someone recently diagnosed. Twice. I mentioned I'd been thinking about picking up part-time work at the hardware store just to make ends meet, and watched that sentence travel the room like a canapé. Everyone took a piece. Nobody asked a follow-up question. Not what I loved about the houses, not whether I was happy, not one single question about my actual life. That was the first data point that genuinely stung. And I want to be honest about that. I'd walked in braced for cruelty. What I got instead was worse. I got dismissal, warm and total, the kind that erases you while smiling. My father hugged me hello, said it was good to see me, and then didn't say another word to me for 40 minutes, because my father's weather has always followed my mother's. Only Reese kept drifting back into my line of sight, swirling his bourbon, studying me in polite little sips. I gave him my sweetest fixer-upper smile and complimented the shrimp cocktail. Then my mother tapped her glass with her ring, and the room hushed like a curtain going up. "We have a little family tradition before dinner," she announced. We have no such tradition, but that night we did, because that night had a script. My mother stood at the head of the table with a paper she pretended not to need, and delivered what she called a review of the family's year, which turned out to be a shareholder report where the only stock was Marcus. She walked us through his promotion like stations of a pilgrimage, the interviews, the negotiation, the corner office with the skyline view. When she got to the number, she slowed down and gave every digit its own spotlight. $550,000 a year. The table applauded. My uncle whistled. Dana's father raised his glass a half-inch in acknowledgement, and my father beamed the borrowed beam of a man clapping for someone else's weather. Then my mother turned to me, and the temperature of the room moved with her eyes. "And Vivian," she said, consulting her paper as though my life required footnotes, "is still doing the house thing." A beat, perfectly timed. "We keep hoping." The laughter that followed was quiet and terrible, the kind people offer when they're grateful the spotlight found someone else. I smiled and raised my sweet tea to her. One broke sister saluting the fleet. Inside, the ledger added a fresh line. But here's what I noticed while the table chuckled at my expense, and it's the detail that kept me from enjoying my own experiment even a little. Whitman Reese wasn't laughing. He was looking between Marcus and me with the stalled expression of a man doing arithmetic that refuses to come out even. He'd heard the words, house thing, and something about them was bothering him. The doorbell rang in the middle of the applause, and my grandfather Walton came in with the cold still clinging to his coat. 88 years old, all 5'6" of him carrying more opinions than most rooms could hold. The room rearranged itself around him the way rooms do around people who cannot be managed. He hugged Marcus and said congratulations like he meant every word. Then he found me, held on a beat longer than usual, and said quietly into my ear, "Stay close tonight." Before I could ask what he meant, he was already moving toward his chair, which my mother had placed, I noticed, at the far end past the cousins, the seat you give a child or a problem. My mother caught the thread of her own performance again. Grandpa Walton, we were just celebrating Marcus. 550,000. Can you imagine? My grandfather settled into his chair, snapped his napkin open with the crispness of a man who has buried a wife and outlived 2 business partners, and said, "Money's loud, worth's quiet." The table did the polite laugh it does when it can't tell if it's been blessed or slapped. My mother's smile tightened 1 notch. "Well, tonight we're allowed a little noise," she said, and steered everyone toward the dining room before my grandfather could reload. I helped him with his chair, and his hand found my wrist under the table's edge and squeezed. Not affection, a signal, the kind you give before a wave hits. My grandfather knew something about that night I still didn't. Between his warning and Reese's stare, my simple little experiment was suddenly running on a much more crowded track than I'd planned for. Before we sat down to eat, Reese finally made his move, cornering me by the bar cart with the gentle inevitability of a man who's run 1,000 meetings. "So, Vivian, the house flipper," he said pleasantly, though his eyes were still doing arithmetic. He walked me through commercial real estate trends, fascinating times for regional banking, watching my face the whole time, and then he set the hook with the ease of long practice. "Ashford handles the debt for a development group that's been buying up half the historic districts from here to Charlotte. You'd never guess who's actually behind it. Trade papers call the owner a ghost." I asked, wide-eyed, whether a company could really be run by someone nobody had ever met. He laughed, but the laugh didn't reach the arithmetic behind his eyes. "I sat across a closing table in Atlanta once, about 1.5 years ago. Room full of attorneys and bankers. This woman came in for maybe 15 minutes, said almost nothing, and the entire room waited on her nod before anyone moved a term sheet." He leaned in an inch. "Funny thing, you remind me of her." The pause he left was a door held open. I stood in it, holding my sweet tea, 30 seconds from watching 11 years of careful architecture come down at my mother's bar cart, and did the hardest, easy thing in the world. I laughed. "Me? I spend my days arguing with contractors about brick deliveries. But I'll tell my crew a good ghost story about billionaires. They'll love it." His face did something complicated. Then my mother swept him toward the dessert table, and I breathed again. If you've ever been introduced by your job title, or by the absence of one, you know exactly how that room felt. Tell me in the comments what your family calls you at their table. And if someone sent you this video, hit subscribe before dinner's served here, because this meal was about to go somewhere none of us had planned, including me. They sent me to the kitchen for the cranberry relish. Of course they did. Every ambush needs its errands. That's when I saw it. On the sideboard, set apart from the ordinary dishes the way a reliquary sits apart from luggage, sat an envelope. Cream, heavy stock, sealed with a wax stamp of all things, and on the front, in my mother's careful hand, "To Vivian, your future. Love, Mom and Dad." I stood in that kitchen doorway holding a bowl of cranberry relish and read that inscription 3 times. Your future, sealed in wax and set out like a place setting. Through the doorway, I heard my mother and Marcus, voices low and efficient, running the schedule like producers before a broadcast. "After the pie, your father says a few words. Then you present the offer, warm, like a big brother, not like a boss. Then she opens it." A pause, the clink of a serving spoon. Then my mother's voice dropped into a register I recognized from 13 years earlier, calm and certain, and utterly without malice, which is exactly what makes it unbearable. Don't let her answer until everyone's watching. She won't make a scene in front of guests. She never does. And Marcus, my brother, the newly minted senior vice president, the man I had just applauded, said, "I know. That's what I'm counting on." I carried the relish to the table and set it down without spilling a drop. If you'd looked at me, you'd have seen a woman in flannel doing an errand. You would not have seen what I was actually doing, which was standing very still inside myself, watching the last soft thing I felt toward that dinner quietly close its door. Humiliating me hadn't been an impulse. They had rehearsed it. The envelope sat on that sideboard through the entire meal, patient as a verdict. Dinner was long and bright, and I remember almost none of it, because all of it was preamble. When the pie plates were cleared, my mother touched my father's sleeve, and my father rose with a folded sheet of paper and the expression of a man sent to deliver bad weather. "Vivian," he read, and his voice wavered, because whatever else my father is, he isn't a natural executioner. "You're 36 years old. We love you, and it breaks our hearts watching you drift." The letter went on, my mother's sentences in my father's mouth, every clause polished. The renovation business was called Your Way of Hiding. The truck made an appearance. So did my bare ring finger, to a sympathetic murmur from the aunts. I sat with my hands folded and took it, data point after data point, while around the table every face arranged itself into troubled compassion, which from the inside looks exactly like an audience. Then my mother stood, because the opening act never gets to close the show. "Sweetheart, we didn't want another year of this, so we did something about it." She said it with her chin lifted, a woman being brave on my behalf. "We just want you to matter to somebody." There it was, the family motto, laid across my shoulders like a wreath. She nodded, and Marcus went to the sideboard and came back with the cream and wax envelope, setting it in front of me. Inside, on Ashford capital letterhead, sat an employment offer. Executive assistant to the senior vice president, debt originations. Salary, $58,000. Start date, January 2nd. Reporting directly to Marcus Cole. My brother crouched beside my chair, warm as a space heater, and delivered the line he'd clearly rehearsed in the kitchen. "You don't have to be great, Viv. You just have to be near it." I was still looking at the contract, at the tidy signature line with my name typed beneath it. $58,000 offered to me like a life raft, while my own company moved more than that before most people finished their morning coffee, when my mother, flushed with momentum, decided the evening could hold one more announcement. "And since we're all together," she said, "there's a family decision about Grandpa Walton's place." I watched my grandfather's chin come up slowly from the far end of the table. "We've talked to a realtor. In the spring, we're listing the Beaufort property. Grandpa's going to move into Cypress Landing. There's a waiting list, but I made some calls." She said "made some calls" the way other people say "performed surgery." The proceeds will set him up beautifully, and honestly, that old place needs a family in it, not one man rattling around alone. My grandfather said evenly, "Wasn't aware I'd asked." My mother laughed the laugh she uses to smooth over other people's discomfort. "Dad, be realistic. Who's going to keep that property? Not Vivian. She turned to me here, smiling, including me, delivering it without a gram of cruelty in her voice, which is the thing about my mother I've never been able to explain to anyone outside this family. Honey, you couldn't afford the dock. The table chuckled. Dana toasted new chapters. And I looked down the length of that white tablecloth at my grandfather, the one person in that family who had ever kept my secret without once asking to see behind it, sitting in the far chair, being liquidated by committee between the pie and the coffee. And I understood, finally and completely, why he'd needed me there that night. My experiment was over. Something else had started. What happened next happened the way pressure always builds in my family. Softly, from every direction at once, with love as the stated reason. My mother produced a pen, didn't offer it, produced it, and laid it across the contract at a precise stage manager's angle. Sign it tonight, sweetheart. Start the new year fresh. Marcus talked about growth mindset. My aunt said opportunities like this don't knock twice, not at your age. My uncle observed to no one in particular that some people need the nest kicked out from under them or they never learn to fly. And the table murmured its agreement. The same agreement from 13 years earlier, aged like bad wine. And Dana, sweet, nervous Dana, who I'd met exactly twice before that night, leaned toward me with her eyes shining and made her own small contribution to the pile. Vivian, I know it probably feels like a lot, but Marcus is so good at this. He could really teach you. I thought about the closing table in Atlanta, the room where nobody moved until the quiet woman by the window nodded. I looked at the pen lying across the contract. 2 days earlier, with a different pen, on a different signature line, I had wired $110 million and driven back to Bull Street to argue about a delivery of reclaimed brick. My whole family leaned in, waiting to watch the failure finally accept her rescue. And then, for the third time that evening, Whitman Reese's phone buzzed in his jacket, and this time, when he read the screen, the managing director of Ashford Capital went the color of the tablecloth. I asked for a moment to think, which the table granted with visible relief. The condemned always gets one last request, and stepped onto the back porch with my phone. I called Renata, who picked up on the first ring, which meant it was bad. I was about to call you, she said. Ashford's board is meeting tonight. Emergency session. Someone over there caught wind of the concentration risk memo. I watched my breath fog in the porch light and asked what they were planning. Damage control, with someone else's money. They're accelerating the new SVP's equity commitment. They want it signed by December 26th so they can announce leadership stability before word gets out about the covenant breaches. I knew exactly what an equity commitment meant at a bank that size, but I asked anyway because I needed to hear it said out loud. Personal capital contribution, Renata said. $310,000, standard skin in the game. Except the game's already over. That money's a sandbag against a flood, Vivian. It buys them maybe a quarter, if that. Through the kitchen window, I could see my brother laughing at something, head tipped back, the newly minted senior vice president at the top of his ear. His bank was about to let him pour his life savings into a hole they already knew was cracked, while his own family's biggest financing client, me, stood on the porch deciding whether to pull the last pin. If we walk the relationship, they lose their anchor client by February, Renata said, flat as always. If we stay quiet, your brother buys the sinking ship. What do you want to do? Snow wasn't falling. This was Savannah in November, but the air had that particular sharp stillness that makes everything feel suspended. Inside, My mother was refilling Reese's glass and glancing toward the porch, wondering what was keeping the guest of dishonor. "Nothing yet," I told Renata. "Keep your phone on." Then I went back inside where the night, it turned out, wasn't finished cornering me. Reese intercepted me in the hallway between the kitchen and dining room, one hand light on my elbow, all charm with nothing behind the eyes but calculation. "Borrow you for a minute? Your father's study won't take long." A managing director doesn't ask, he schedules. I let him steer me into my father's little den, fishing trophies, a desk nobody ever writes at, the smell of old carpet and older certainty. He shut the door with a click that rearranged the whole evening. No preamble this time. The charm came off like a coat. "Atlanta," he said. "About 18 months ago. 22nd floor, Kessler and Vance. A financing closing for a development group's acquisition. Present were 6 attorneys, 3 bankers, your company's chief operating officer, whoever she is, and a woman who came in late, sat in the last chair by the window and said almost nothing the entire meeting." He ticked it off on his fingers, watching me. And when the terms shifted at the 11th hour, every person in that room, including 2 partners billing $1,200 an hour, stopped talking and waited on her. She nodded once, and $90 million moved. He took a step closer, lowering his voice as though the fishing trophies might testify against him. "I represented the seller that day, Miss Cole. I've spent a year and a half wondering who that woman was. Then tonight, I walk into a Thanksgiving dinner in Savannah, and she's sitting across the table getting lectured about a house-flipping hobby." The furnace hummed somewhere down the hall. My mother laughed at her own joke through the wall. Reese spread his hands, almost gently, like a man laying down a winning card he wished were smaller. "So before I say a word to anyone, tell me I'm wrong." That right there was the last exit on the highway. I want to be honest with you about that moment because it's the hinge the rest of my life turned on. I could have lied. I had 11 years of practice, a face built for it, and a cover story boring enough to defend itself. A laugh, a shrug, "You caught me. I snuck into a closing once for the free coffee." Reese would have doubted his own memory by morning, because men like him would always rather doubt what they remember than believe a woman in a flannel shirt outranks them. The fortress would have held. Nobody would ever have known. I stood in my father's study, in the house where I'd learned to disappear, and heard my grandfather's voice from the head of my own memory. "Stay close tonight." And I was so tired. Tired in my teeth. Tired of being a ghost at every table I'd built and every table I was born into. So I said it. "Last chair by the window." 2 beats of silence. Then Whitman Reese aged and lightened at exactly the same time. A man watching a winning lottery ticket and a subpoena arrive in the same envelope. "My God," he said, "you're Cole Meridian." What he did next told me everything about him and about the world my mother has always worshipped, because he didn't apologize for the evening he'd just watched them put me through. He negotiated. Voice down, hands open, the pivot so fast it whistled past. "Extend the relationship," he murmured. "Get us through the second quarter, and there's no reason anyone needs to hear about tonight's little unpleasantness. No reason either to trouble anyone with the details of the equity commitments. That contribution shores up the bridge." He actually said it out loud. "And your brother gets to keep his title. Everybody wins." There it was, offered to me like a mint on a pillow. My secret, my brother's savings, and his sinking bank, all tied up with one bow. I looked at him for a long moment. "Enjoy the pie, Whitman," I said, and walked out of the study, leaving my old life behind me in it. I didn't go back to the table. I went out the back door into the cold, no coat, because I needed air nobody in that house had breathed yet, and found the porch already occupied. My grandfather sat on the old glider in his wool coat, mittened hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the dark yard like it owed him something. I sat down beside him. For a while, neither of us said anything, which with my grandfather is a complete conversation. Then he said, "They get to the house yet? Or just the part where they save you from yourself?" I told him both. He nodded, unsurprised. He'd smelled the whole agenda days ago, which is why he'd summoned me, his one ally in a family of auctioneers. I almost told him everything right then. Cole Meridian, Atlanta, the man in the study. But he spoke first. "You know what your problem is, Vivi?" It wasn't a question. "Same as your mother's, turned inside out. She needs the whole world to see her worth. You need to make sure nobody ever does." The glider creaked. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and quit. "You've been running a test on this family for 11 years, sitting there in your work boots keeping score." He turned and looked at me. 88 years of him, eyes like water under ice. Nobody passes a test they don't know they're taking. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to bring up the piano bench, the index cards, my aunt's murmured agreement, and found the cupboard bare. He patted my knee with a mittened hand. "Money's loud," he said, softer now. "Worth's quiet. But quiet and hidden aren't the same thing, and you've been calling one the other for a long time." Inside, I could hear my mother gathering her audience again. By the time I came in from the porch, Reese had performed triage on his own panic. He stood by the sideboard with a fresh drink and a managing director's smile, and as I walked in, he raised his glass and announced to the room, "Word is, Ashford's got some exciting news coming with Cole Meridian in the new year." He said it looking directly at me. A message, a lure, a leash, all three at once. My mother, who couldn't pick Cole Meridian out of a phone book but knows the word partnership in a rich man's mouth when she hears it, lit up on the spot. "Did you hear that, everyone? Marcus's firm! Partnering!" And because momentum is my mother's one true religion, she swung it right back around to me, which made the moment almost perfect. "Vivian, the pen's still warm, sweetheart." The contract had migrated to the sideboard, wax seal and all, pen resting across it. "Sign it here, with everyone we love as witnesses. Give your father his Thanksgiving gift." The whole table again, plus one managing director watching with intensely personal interest whether the ghost of Cole Meridian was about to become his future son-in-law's assistant. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. Marcus nodded encouragement, radiant, oblivious. 2 days from wiring $310,000 onto a sinking ship at the direction of the man currently refilling his glass at my parents' sideboard. "We just want you to matter to somebody," my mother said, for the 3rd time that day, and held out the pen. If you've ever stood at a family table while everyone you love waited for you to shrink down to fit the box they'd wrapped for you, put it in the comments. I read every one and I believe you. Stay with me, because what I did in the next 10 minutes is the reason this story exists. I looked at the pen, then asked my mother politely if I could say something first. Before the room could get its show, Marcus, reading my face and mistaking what he saw there for stage fright, laughed his easy laugh and said, "Give us 2 minutes, everyone," steering me into the kitchen by the wrist, older brother style, the same way he used to pull me out of church when I was little. The door swung shut on the party. And then, my brother, Senior Vice President, $550,000 a year, sagged against the counter like a puppet with the hand withdrawn. For the first time in probably 15 years, I saw the actual Marcus underneath the polish. "Please just sign it," he said, and his voice was thin wire. "I know it's beneath you. I know Mom's being Mom. But if you're settled somewhere, she'll finally back off. You have no idea what it's like being the one she—" He stopped himself, but the sentence finished itself in my head anyway. Being the one she aims at the sky instead of the ground. He rubbed his eyes, careless of anyone watching. 3 weeks into the promotion and the numbers don't add up right. Every report comes back adjusted. Finance keeps rescheduling my briefings. And now there's this equity contribution the board wants signed by the 26th. New SVP buys in personally, shows the market confidence. He tried to laugh. "It's my whole savings, Viv. Dana doesn't even know all of it yet. But Reese says it's standard, and he's been doing this 30 years. He looked up at me. My older brother drowning in front of me in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon. And what he asked for broke something in me cleanly. Because he didn't ask for help. He had no idea help was standing right in front of him. He asked, "Just take the job, Viv, so Mom relaxes, so one of us gets to breathe." That's when I finally understood the family arithmetic. They hadn't built a ladder for him and a cage for me. They'd built 2 cages and gold-plated one of them. I stood in my mother's kitchen holding my brother's secret, and my options laid themselves out side by side, tidy as a closing statement, because that's how my mind works even when my chest hurts. Option 1. Stay hidden. Walk out, drive home, let the Ashford relationship terminate in February like the analysts recommended. Cut this family loose and keep the answer my test had already delivered. They treat a woman they think has nothing like a burden to be managed. End of report. The fortress survives. Marcus signs on the 26th and loses everything. And technically, none of it would be my doing. I could tell myself that for the rest of my life, roughly once an hour. Option 2. Spend it. Spend the secret I'd guarded for 11 years, the ghost that had kept me safe, the last clean answer I would ever get to the question of whether my family could love me small. Spend all of it, right there, in front of the aunts and the murmured agreements and the managing director, to save the brother who had just asked me to be his assistant. My grandfather's voice sat in the middle of that ledger like a paperweight. Nobody passes a test they don't know they're taking. For 11 years, the safest room in my life had been the one where nobody knew me. Standing in that kitchen, I finally did the math on what the rent had actually cost. I took my brother's hand off the counter, gently, the way you take a glass from someone before delivering news. Then I walked back through the swinging door into the dining room, past the sideboard, to the head of the table. I did not pick up the pen. "Marcus," I said, "one question before anyone signs anything in this family tonight." The room went curious and quiet. My brother came through the door behind me, confused. "Has anyone shown you Ashford's actual covenant compliance report? The real one, not the summary version." Across the room, Whitman Reese set his glass down so fast it cracked against the sideboard. "Vivian," my mother hissed, "sit down." But I stayed on my feet and kept my voice at exactly the pitch I use with a nervous contractor, because nothing unsettles loud people quite like calm. "2 covenant breaches in the last 2 quarters, I said to Marcus, only to Marcus. "A loan committee memo flagging your bank's concentration risk with its single largest lending relationship, which happens to be my company. Which is why, 3 weeks after your promotion, your board suddenly needs its brand new senior vice president to write a personal check for $310,000 and call it confidence. The words landed on the table like dropped silverware. My uncle snorted. Where's this coming from? Some finance blog? My aunt murmured something about jealousy as though a diagnosis had finally been confirmed. My mother stood, actually wringing her napkin. Vivian Cole, your brother runs a bank division. You flip houses. Apologize right now. I didn't move, because I was watching the only person in that room whose reaction to my information actually mattered. And Whitman Reese had gone the gray of wet newspaper. He tried twice to laugh it off. Colorful theories, holiday emotions, and both times the laugh died in the air, because the room had already seen his face in the second before he rebuilt it. And the room, whatever else it was, wasn't stupid. Marcus looked from Reese to me and back, and I watched 3 weeks of fog condense into one cold, clear droplet of understanding. The compliance report, he said slowly, to Reese, not to me. I asked finance for the detail twice. Twice, Whitman. I got summaries both times. His voice didn't rise, it dropped. And for one strange, proud second, he sounded exactly like our grandfather. Why does my sister know my bank's numbers? And there it was, the question finally arriving, standing in the middle of my mother's Thanksgiving like an uninvited guest. Every face at that table turned to me. I took one breath, 13 years long. Because Cole Meridian is mine, I said. One sentence, and the room stopped like someone had pulled a plug. I founded it 11 years ago. I own 71% of it. My company is Ashford's largest client relationship in this entire region, and my analysts spent 3 weeks deciding whether to walk away from your bank, Marcus. That's how I know your numbers. They cross my desk before they cross yours. Silence has a sound. It's the ice shifting in 12 abandoned glasses. My mother laughed, and I want you to understand, she genuinely laughed, a bright social peal, looking around the table for company, because a sentence I'd just said had nowhere to land in the universe she lived in. Vivian, sweetheart, Cole Meridian is a $2 billion company. Whitman, tell her. She turned to him, still smiling, holding the moment out like a plate that needed taking. And Whitman Reese looked at me. One long look. Atlanta, the study, the whole arithmetic finally balancing, and said the only word he had left. Atlanta. Then he sat down carefully, like a man protecting a bad back, and set his drink on the floor beside his chair. My mother's smile stayed up a full 3 seconds after everything behind it had already collapsed. I watched it happen, and I want to be honest with you, the way I promised I would be at the start of this. Watching it, I felt no triumph at all. I felt the floor of 13 years drop out from under me, because her face moved from scorn to shock. And then, this is the part that cost me something even in the retelling. I watched my own mother begin to reappraise me in real time, the exact way a woman reappraises a house when the neighborhood suddenly comes up. And I understood with perfect clarity the price of what I'd just spent. I would never again know for certain which version of her love was actually for me and which was for the number. That answer had been the entire point of my test, and it burned down with the fortress, all in one sentence. My grandfather's mug clicked softly against the side table. My father whispered my name like a fact he was double-checking. I turned to my mother and finished it quietly. You told me dreams were a luxury for people who could afford the fall, Mom. I could afford mine. You just never asked. My mother recovered the way weather recovers. Total, immediate, shameless. 10 seconds of dead air, and then the tears arrived right on schedule, and she came around the table with both arms rising like a drawbridge in reverse. My daughter, my brilliant, secretive girl. I always knew. Didn't I always say she had something, Robert? Didn't I? I stepped back. One small, complete step, and it stopped her mid-reach. No, I said, and there was no anger in it, which I think is exactly why it worked. You don't get to be proud of me tonight. An hour ago, I was your failure. You wrapped my rescue in wax paper and rehearsed my ambush in the kitchen. The only thing that's changed since then is a number. Her mouth opened. I said the rest before it could deploy. I was always somebody, Mom. You were just waiting for a figure. My aunt studied the tablecloth. Dana put down her phone. I picked up the contract, my future in its cream and wax coffin, folded it neatly along its original crease, and set it beside my plate, squared to the table edge, the way you return something borrowed. The answer's no. To this job, and to the other offer I got tonight. I glanced at Reese, still parked in his chair, the one where I stay quiet and everybody wins. My mother turned to my father, opening the channel she'd used for 38 years, the one where he clears his throat and restores order in her voice. And my father stood up, looked at his wife, and for the first time in my witnessed life, went off script. Elaine, sit down. Quiet, not unkind, absolutely unprecedented. Sit down and let the girl talk. I read that letter tonight because you told me she needed saving. Seems to me we ought to hear what she thinks needs saving in this room. My mother sat. The whole house seemed to lean in, and I turned to face the managing director. Whitman, he straightened like a man called on in class. Here's what happens now, and you can decide in front of the witnesses you performed for all night. I kept my voice level, boardroom plain, because the numbers were flourish enough on their own. Cole Meridian extends Ashford's financing terms through the second quarter. 2 conditions. 1, the equity commitment on your new senior vice president disappears tonight. He doesn't wire $1 of it, ever. 2, an independent audit, a firm of my choosing, full access to the books, complete transparency to Marcus by January 15th. He runs a real division with real numbers, or you can explain to your board why your largest client sent a termination notice on December 26th, and why you sat at this table all night watching your board's problem get solved with his life savings. I let it sit. You have until the coffee goes cold. Nobody breathed. Reese looked around the table, at the aunts, at my father still standing by the sideboard where the toast had been, a managing director discovering that a family Thanksgiving had quietly become the most consequential meeting of his year, with a hostile majority of 1. He picked his drink up off the floor, set it back on the table, and said, "Agreed." Just that, gray and small. And my brother, $550,000 a year, corner office, skyline view, made a sound I hadn't heard from him since we were kids, half hiccup, half sob, and walked out of the dining room into the kitchen where his legs simply gave out. He slid down the cabinets to the floor and sat there on the tile, crying into his hands in his good suit. I told you at the start. By the end of that night, my brother was sitting on a kitchen floor with his hands shaking, and it had nothing to do with anything I own. He was shaking because someone had finally stood between him and the people spending him. It had just never once occurred to him that it would be me. I sat with Marcus on that kitchen floor for a while. Some things you do in a suit, some things you do in flannel. Turns out this one works fine in either. When his breathing evened out, I got my coat from the hook by the door and walked out into the November night. My mother followed me. Of course she did. But when she reached the driveway, she didn't perform. She just stood there under the porch light with her arms crossed against the cold, and when she finally spoke, both the syrup and the steel were gone, and underneath them was a tired woman from the wrong side of a hardware counter. My father told me a hardware clerk's daughter shouldn't dream past the register, she said. I spent 30 years selling real estate to women who never once remembered my name. The cold sat between us. I thought if you and your brother had titles, the world couldn't do to you what it did to me. That's what I thought love was. Armor. It is the only near true apology I have ever gotten from her. And standing there, I felt both its weight and its limit at the same time. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 13 years, I told her. Say it again sometime. Some night when you haven't just been caught. I got in the truck and backed out of the driveway, and in the mirror she got smaller and smaller under the porch light, still standing there when I turned the corner. Here's what I took home instead of the answer I'd originally come for. I got proof of exactly how they treat someone with nothing. The price is that I'll never fully trust how they treat me now that I'm someone. I made that trade with my eyes open. I'd make it again. Here's what a year did. The audit took 9 weeks and read like a weather report from inside a hurricane. 3 years of numbers wearing makeup. Whitman Reese resigned from Ashford's board in February to pursue other opportunities, which is banker for before the vote happened. Ashford's regional footprint shrank by nearly a third. 2 branch offices closed. What was left was a smaller, more honest institution that answers its covenant questions on time now. I know because I still see the reports. Line item, monthly, same as everyone else. Marcus stayed. The board that remained offered him the real job at real terms, a smaller title but an actual mandate, and he told me it was the first offer in his career he was certain he'd actually earned. His $310,000 never left his account. Dana learned all of it over one long January night, and their engagement is its own story, not mine to tell here. The Beaufort property never got listed. I bought it that spring, market price, straightforward paperwork, because my grandfather does not accept charity and I wasn't foolish enough to offer any. He still lives there and pays me rent of 1 pecan pie a month, terms he dictated and I initialed without argument. As for the ghost, the trade press found the story by April, the way they always do eventually. Coal Meridian founder revealed, one headline read, with a photo of me on a job site that made me look like I'd been ambushed by a photographer, which, to be fair, I had. Savannah buzzed about it for maybe 2 weeks and then did the wonderful thing small cities do, which is decide your news is old. The block on Bull Street is still full of scaffolding on Saturdays. My mother and I began the slow, unglamorous work of finding out what we actually are to each other when nobody's performing for an audience. This Thanksgiving, there were 6 of us at a table set for exactly 6. My parents, my grandfather, Marcus, Dana, and me. No caterer's assistant at the door, no place cards, no titles printed under anyone's name, no toast reviewing the year's earnings, because we'd all lived through it and didn't need the shareholder version repeated back to us. My mother is still my mother. She started telling the neighbors in October that her daughter was, in real estate development, actually quite significant. Caught my eye across the yard mid-sentence and stopped herself. That clumsy little correction, repeated a dozen different ways over a dozen months, is what change actually looks like at 61. It isn't a movie apology. It's a woman catching her own voice in the air and setting it back down more carefully. Under the tree that year, there was one small box for me, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a battered old compass, my grandfather's, the one he'd carried on job sites for 40 years before he handed the business to my father, who never wanted it. On the inside of the lid, my mother had had someone engrave a line. "You were right about what things are worth. Love, Mom." At dinner, a neighbor stopped by with a pie, and my mother introduced me, and I watched her choose her words. "This is my daughter, Vivian. She's saved half the historic buildings on the east side without anyone noticing." No title, no number, just that. Then she squeezed my shoulder and went to get the coffee going. My grandfather caught my eye down the table and winked, slow as a lighthouse. "Money's loud," he told this family once, "and worth is quiet." This year, for the first time I can remember, my family finally lowered its voice, and I stopped hiding inside the hush. If the people you love only really see you when you shine, the bravest thing you can do isn't hiding your light, and it isn't blinding them with it either. It's standing in plain sight at your full size and letting them decide what to do with the view. That's my story. One dinner, one envelope with my name on it, and a signature I never gave. If someone at your table only measures you in titles and paychecks, let this be your sign to stop shrinking to fit the box. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And subscribe, because there are more quiet women with loud stories where this one came from. I'll see you in the next one.